Trust in politics is broken. So can we get UK politics working again?
That was the last time we were happy. 2012.
I'm Beth Rigby, Sky's political editor. Join me every week with Labour's Jess Phillips and Conservative peer Ruth Davidson for some electoral dysfunction.
This idea of nuance has completely left politics.
Yeah. Together, we'll focus on the policies that could deliver political satisfaction. Follow Electoral Dysfunction wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to this special election edition of The Daily. More than 2,600 seats across 107 English councils, 11 mayoral elections, including in the capital, plus polling for the London Assembly, 37 police and crime commissioners, and a cheeky Blackpool by-election too. And if you've just tuned in, it's certainly not been the best of times for the Tories. Joining us, as always, Sky News elections analyst Professor Michael Thrasher and our deputy political editor Sam Coates. And guys, later we're going to take the results, look forward to the general election, what it all might mean. But first, what actually happened? What still is happening? We're recording this Friday evening, Sam, and how does it look?
It's a patchwork of results. We can start to put together a story of what's going on in our politics, but it's only the start. But it's nevertheless been a fascinating day in terms of what we're learning.
But Michael, I'm certainly not wrong in my characterisation of this as an awful time for the Tories.
We can all agree on that. Even the Conservatives have to admit that in terms of the number of seats that they're projected to lose, it's at the upper end of our estimate. So it's as bad as it could be. What makes this difficult for the Conservatives is this precious little time now to turn it around in terms of their fortunes.
I mentioned signals. What I think is going on, and I think the big picture of what's going on, is that there is an unwinding of the electoral coalition that Boris Johnson knitted together in 2019 in order to generate the 80-strong majority that he got that confounded the politics of that moment. And it's a series of different, and I call them signals because it's not proof, nothing is inevitable, but you look at the third largest swing since the Second World War from the Conservatives all the way to the Labour Party in Blackpool South. You look at the Tories losing, I think it is still over half the councillors that they put up. They put up 1,000. So in the end, if that trend continues, if that proportion continues to be lost, we're looking at a loss of 500 or so councillors. You're looking at where the Conservative Party are losing all the way to Labour. You know, places like Welwyn Hatfield, where the Defence Secretary has his parliamentary seat, Swindon, Portsmouth. And then you're looking at some of the bright spots for the Conservatives, things like the Tees Valley Mayor victory by Ben Houchen. And that was done, yes, a stunning victory against the national trend, but nevertheless involving a somewhere in the region of 20-point drop in the Tory share of the vote. All of this, I think, points to the idea with Labour winning more in Leave areas that we can call it something that looks like a realignment.
Let's start then with the nitty-gritty in terms of Blackpool South then. We're talking really significant swings, aren't we?
Yes, and it reflects to a large degree the extent to which, and you know, Sam was referring to this really, the extent to which voters are only loosely aligned with political parties, if at all. And therefore the scale of these swings is exaggerated because former Conservatives have no qualms about switching their votes to another party. And also there is a sense in which I've long suspected that in the current crop of by-elections, there's probably quite a lot of Conservative supporters out there who simply can't bring themselves to vote in these contests. I mean, a 30% turnout does suggest a little bit of that, doesn't it? And there's been similar drops elsewhere. So the Conservatives have done very, very poorly, not only to Labour, of course, but earlier on in the Parliament they were losing seats to the Liberal Democrats. Again, we search through the record books to see swings of this size, majorities overturned of this size. So it's a bleak picture.
Sam, your analysis of what happened with Ben Houchen and the Teesside mayor job, we talked about a week ago about what we were supposed to be looking out for in terms of these local elections, and Ben Houchen not being mayor was something that we were supposed to be kind of keeping our eyes peeled for. It hasn't happened, and Rishi Sunak's he's shouting about it from the rooftops.
That's right. Look, I went about 10 days ago to the Tees Valley, and I have to say, I told you so. Because
yes, you did.
Because I thought that was unlikely that he would lose. And the reason it was unlikely is because he was running a campaign less in the mould and with the assistance of Rishi Sunak and much more in the mould of Boris Johnson. You know, it was a personality-based, big promises, big spending.
Big personality as well.
Big personality campaign set against a Labour challenger whose friends even thought he was going to lose and said so on camera by accident. And I'm not hugely surprised at the result. I do understand Downing Street's desire to present this as an unmitigated win. He is a Tory mayor in a Labour area, and it is a bright spot. It allows Rishi Sunak to claim it's not all over for the Red Wall. But I think the truth is that, I mean, just set it against the result in Hartlepool. You know, there we had a direct switch from the Conservatives to Labour. So in the area where there is no big personality for people to vote to, the same voters will switch their vote from Labour to the Conservatives, or the vote shares will switch such that the seats can change hands, because you can't really say a voter did this on the basis of results.
Some of the reasoning that lies behind, first, the creation of the London mayor was to return some local government to Greater London. And when the Conservatives picked up on the idea of these combined authority mayors, again, the reasoning was that these regions required big personalities to be able to sort of represent the region and be able to talk on a level which kind of befitted the fact that this is a regional voice rather than a local voice. And so we shouldn't be entirely surprised. And in some ways we should be rather pleased that we've got the election of these mayors that seems to run counter to electoral trends happening elsewhere.
It's sort of a sign of success of the devolution agenda, that people understand that you get something different from your mayor than you do from Westminster. And actually, I think if there's a winner, like if there's an unambiguous winner, it's the idea of combined mayoralties.
Two other topics which fascinate me at this set of local elections. You know, what is going on with reform, but also why we've seen such a significant rise in the number of independent. If we start with reform, I mean, when the Tories are losing votes, is it just a straight swap? It doesn't look like it when you look at some of the councils in Nuneaton and elsewhere where you're seeing, double-digit switches between the Conservatives and Labour.
Yes, it depends on where you are. But I think, let's just remind everyone that the reform fielded 300 candidates. And as you said at the outset, there's over 2,600 seats. So that begs the question, why aren't they fighting more? And I don't have an easy answer to that, but I suspect they just couldn't muster the required number of candidates. But what they have done, I think, is situated those candidates in places like Sunderland, places like Hartlepool, places like Walsall, where they're going to have, if you like, a maximum impact to demonstrate that where we stand, we can hurt the Conservatives. And because they've had candidates standing in the mayoral elections, it's an easy, you only need one candidate and you suddenly have got a voice being listened to by a very large electorate in these areas. So I think there's a degree of sophistication.
And it's a tactic, the Greens have used as well, isn't it? Get yourself local council representation and then try and leverage that so you get parliamentary representation.
We finally got proof of concept to Reform UK. I'm not entirely sure before today I believed it wasn't just a polling phenomenon in places where, you didn't know whether Reform was going to stand. Where it stands, as Michael just said, there was some level of success. And I think that there are two consequences for that. The first is, in an environment in which the Tories are going to ask themselves, how can we get ourselves out of the hole, they find themselves facing two ways: the centre ground, Labour, where they're losing votes to, but also to Reform. Secondly, there's a kind of conversation, which is the same conversation I think we had in 2019, which is going to be almighty kind of donor forces and big guys in the shadows trying to stop Reform from putting up candidates in the vast majority of seats. That in the ultimately was a key factor in 2019. It probably contributed quite significantly to the Conservative success not to see parts of the Tory vote like sort of siphoned off by Brexit supporting voters by the Brexit Party as it was at that point, led by Nigel Farage. Will that be a dynamic? So I think all of that now is in play as a consequence.
Let's though reflect on the number of independents that we have seen returned as councillors, and this in some way I think has to be seen as linked to, well, the analysis showing that, you know, in kind of, you know, areas with a larger than average kind of Muslim population, the vote has been moving away from Labour to these independent candidates. I mean, Gaza does appear to have been an issue on the doorstep, Sam, but it's whether or not the concerns at Labour HQ are such that it makes them change direction, and I think you're of the view that it won't.
Look at very specific examples. Look in Newcastle, in the Ellswick ward, when that was contested last year, Labour won, get this, 71% of the vote. And today it lost in a swing of 30 points to the Greens, who've been campaigning for a different position on what's going on in the Middle East. When I look at that, do I think that Labour HQ will watch that result and take fright? I'm not entirely sure I do, because it's not entirely clear to me that Labour are particularly nervous about losing the seat of Newcastle. And one of the contributors today on Sky News actually said the quiet bit out loud, as it were. Sonia Soda said, well, maybe these are votes that Labour HQ are willing to lose because they're in areas where the Labour support is piled up, that you can afford to lose a bit of it. And it's bloody electoral calculation, but you shouldn't be surprised about that in election year.
A couple of things that we will not find out either during the recording of this podcast or indeed for another few hours. Andy Street, whether or not he remains as mayor in the West Midlands, and indeed whether or not Sadiq Khan remains as mayor in London. I mean, Michael, do we have any indication on either of those? Because if I was going by social media, I'd be thinking, well, Andy Street's absolutely certain to be there, and there's a real chance that we could be seeing a change at City Hall in London.
Yeah, I think the polling, there's been quite extensive polling on the London mayoral election, and the polls are more or less in line with one another, which says that Khan is going to get around about 40+% of the vote, and Hall is quite a long way back, is his nearest challenger. I really don't see that outcome being in question, and so Khan becomes.
We're going to play this back to you the next time you're on the podcast when he loses.
Yes, but I'm confident here.
I know
confident
you are.
of this. The situation with Andy Street in the West Midlands is that it's much tighter.
Yeah.
And don't forget that financially, Birmingham is in a bad place. And if we remind ourselves of what happened in Thurrock, where, again, financially challenged and down to the Conservatives there, the Conservatives got panned. And so if something happens similarly in regard to the mayoral election, then Street could hold on.
We're going to take a very, very short break. When we come back, I can see right in front of Michael right now the projections that we do from these local election results. What might it mean for the general election? Find out after this. Welcome back to the Sky News Daily. We continue with our election special. Sam Coates, Michael Thrasher, still here in this pokey wee Westminster studio that we've got. And Michael, it's a kind of a drum roll moment. Well, you've taken the data, such as we have right now, you've done the numbers, crunched them, and we have a projection for what this might mean at a parliamentary set of elections. Explain what the process is and indeed what you've discovered.
Yes. Basically what we're doing is we're counting the votes over 1,400 wards. And as those wards declare, then we input them into our system. And essentially what we're looking at is comparing the change in the vote in those wards with a previous local election. And that, as you say, that points a bleak picture for the Conservatives.
But perhaps not quite as bleak as some would have hoped on the Labour side, I should suggest. Tell us the figures.
No, and not as low as the opinion polls suggest. But the figures we have for the Conservatives, after we've counted wards where over 2 million votes were cast, by the way, so the Conservatives fell to 26% and Labour is on 35%. Let's put that into context. The Conservatives are down 19 percentage points compared with the general election. But Labour is only up 2 percentage points from that same general election.
And that sounds like a 9-point gap between the two of them, which doesn't sit well in my mind with the 20-point gap which we are seeing when it comes to opinion polls.
Absolutely. But we assume that the swing that we're witnessing in terms of the Conservative decline and the modest Labour rise applies in every constituency.
Right, I see.
So we plug those numbers in, and lo and behold, it reveals.
So what are the seat totals then on that?
The Labour overtake the Conservatives. The Conservatives lose their overall majority. They're overtaken by Labour, but critically, Labour falls short on 294 seats, 32 seats short of an overall majority, which is 326 on the new House of Commons.
I'm interested in understanding these figures because I have to say I want to understand what they represent and the caveats of what we need to take into account. So if we could just start with the national estimated share, Michael. So you have the Tories on 26%. YouGov poll goes down as low as 18. That feels a little bit low. I think the question everyone wants to know is: are the polls wrong, or are we measuring different things?
To a degree, we're measuring different things, and we referred earlier to some amazing swings in vote, not necessarily between the Conservative and Labour. So we have, Tories falling 19, Labour up 2. Those two things don't balance out, do they?
No.
Right? And so where are these votes disappearing to? And the answer is they're disappearing into the Greens, they're going to Reform, they're also going to these independents that did so well in some Labour voting areas.
In that national estimated share, you have others on 22%.
Yeah.
Can you think of precedent where there are other candidates to vote for in a general election like there are in a local election of a credibility that would get you anything like to that figure?
Wasn't that always the problem with UKIP?
Well, I mean, the reality is that in terms of the next general election, there are two main parties in play, aren't there?
Yeah.
Right. It's Conservative and Labour. And what happens with the smaller parties, it's just part of the narrative. But just going back to the poll, it's a good question now. In terms of, are we looking at two different things here in terms of the polls and in terms of the council elections? And my general response to that is it is increasingly the case that in local elections, voters have an increasing tendency to sort of feel easy about voting for smaller parties, easy to vote for local independents that seem to have a resonance for them in some local authority areas. And in terms of national vote intention, we were referring earlier about Reform, right? And although they've done well, they've stood in areas where they are strong. And the idea that they are going to get as many votes as the national opinion polls currently suggest, I'm not so sure about that.
I just want to look at now the Commons projection that we've got. Does that add up to 650?
Yes.
So the SNP are part of the 66 and
are the Northern Ireland, as are...
And so does that take into account the change in Scottish politics that we've seen?
No. You said at the outset, Neil, that any projection, right, we have to sort of play with what we've got. We can't introduce a kind of proviso, a caveat, call it what you will, that says this is what we've done for Scotland because we don't have any local election votes. We just leave them alone.
And there's one other thing. There are so many points. It's a fascinating projection, but to say it's sort of dropped in and caused a cacophony of comment, understating at this point. One of the big arguments that people like me are getting from the Labour Party is that the places where Labour are now getting more votes are better for them in a general election. Their vote is more efficiently distributed, to use a sort of academic language, than it was in the past. So the scale of swing that they need to pick up is less, closer to 6 points than to 12 points, given the changes in Scotland and the changes in the distribution of the Labour vote, which in some general elections they've been able to pile it up high in urban areas, win 3 times over certain seats, but it doesn't mean that they win the country as a whole because they're not getting enough in the marginals. When Labour say to me, our vote is much more efficient now, but your projection shows a a medium, smaller than the polls to medium-sized lead, getting nowhere near of an overall majority, is that because Labour's talking rubbish?
Not necessarily, although I don't have enough evidence to challenge one way or the other.
And is it because vote distribution doesn't play any part in this model?
No, because it assumes national uniform swing. Yeah. And basically you're caught with that. And Labour will rightly point out that in terms of the actual votes cast in some constituencies, they would have, in inverted commas, won Aldershot. They would have won Plymouth Moorview. And my response to that is, by the same token, you would have lost Blackburn, you would have lost Oldham West to independents. So you can't have it one way, but it doesn't work in the opposite way.
We've had an awful lot of talk about the general election without actually talking about the general election. Sam, just talk to me a little bit about Rishi Sunak and his future now. I mean, Ben Houchen, as we were saying, a few days ago, if he had not won, then the knives would have been out. But surely the knives remain unsheathed right now.
I think that's right. Look, I think when it comes to Conservative politics, the results are bad. I think the results they point to a political realignment from which the Conservatives face an almost impossible task to remain in government. But there are enough things to give emotional Tory MPs that little bit of something to cling on to, and whether that's teas, whether that's the work that Michael's just done, whether that's...
The fact that you're not reading out messages from a Conservative WhatsApp group talking about getting rid of Rishi Sunak is a good thing for Rishi Sunak.
It is, but that doesn't mean there aren't challenges, and I think the challenges come under two buckets. The first is there will be pressure from the Conservative Party to consider how to deal with the challenge of reform. Do they move to the right? Do they start to do something about...
electoral deal of a sort,
or just coming out of the European Convention of Human Rights, making that a manifesto promise, a bit tougher on green pledges, all the stuff that might be meat to the right that would impress reform voters, or do they reject that? But I think more pertinently and more urgently, because that's a theoretical question, it's a whole bunch of legislation that's about to go through the Commons, including in particular a sentencing bill to loosen sentences to try and reduce overcrowding in prisons, which is very unpopular with the right. Will there be rebellions over that? If you're saying, are they about to unseat Rishi Sunak? I think the answer is no. If you're saying, is it all plain sailing between now and the summer for the Prime Minister? I think the answer is also no.
When's the election? I mean, again, I have heard some people thinking, if today had went absolutely catastrophically, why wouldn't he just go for it?
Oh, God, Neil, don't ask that. I don't know.
While Sam's thinking about that, I'm
going to have no answer. I'm projecting no idea.
I was asked by one of Sky's reporters about this question. And I just threw into the ring my thought was that, and let's forget that we've got a US presidential election in November.
Of course.
And
how could I forget?
You really, from our point of view, we don't want them together. But from the politicians' point of view, we don't want them. They don't want them together either. So do you go after the presidential election or before? And my personal view, wacky as it might seem, is that there is an opportunity for Sunak to announce a general election at the end of August that to be held in the first week of October. What that means for the party conferences, Sam would be better placed than me.
That means they don't have them.
Yeah.
They don't have them. And that deprives Labour of a platform whereby they could do a Neil Kinnock, but toned down this time, if you recall the 1992 general election, as some people might, and therefore that works because it gets our election out before the US one.
Sam, final thought. When's the election?
I told you what my answer's been. I don't know. No point in flogging a dead horse.
Quelle surprise. Sam not taking a punt on anything. Sam, Michael, great to have you back on the Daily. We'll see you both again soon. And that is your lot for this special election edition of the Daily, coming to you from our Westminster studio. Much, much more, of course, available over the coming hours as we get more results through. Just switch on your telly or indeed head to www.skynews.com or the app. We'll see you back on the Daily next week.